Two questions I get asked the most here on YouTube is one, how does your Mavic Pro footage look so good? And two, what kind of filters are you using? The answer to the first question is actually the answer to the second question. It's actually all involved in neutral density filters. So in this video, I'm going to show you the Polar Pro neutral density filters that I've been using on my Mavic Pro. These are absolutely the best ones that I found. I've used several different brands. So today we're going to take a look at them, what they do for your Mavic footage, and why you should definitely be using them. Coming up. What's up, guys? Thanks so much for stopping by the channel today. My name's Timothy, and on this channel I focus on tech, tools, and tutorials to help you guys produce the best content that you can for your YouTube channels and production. So if you're new here, definitely consider subscribing. Quick shout out to the guys at Polar Pro for sending these my way. They aren't sponsoring or paying me to say any of these things, but they did send these out to me for free for review, so thanks a lot for supporting the channel. I think it's really important to understand what ND filters do to your camera settings. So if you already know this, somewhere on this screen I'm going to put a timestamp. You can jump through this explanation and go right to the comparison of the Polar Pro filters. But if you don't know what ND filters do and you're curious about the settings on the Mavic Pro camera, then just stick around for these next few minutes and I'm going to explain it right now. So before I get into the footage and showing you exactly what these filters can do for your footage, I wanted to explain really quick what ND filters really are. For those of you that are new to photography, to videography, an ND filter, ND is short for neutral density filter, is essentially a pair of sunglasses for your camera lens. And basically when we're talking about videography and cameras, there are three different types of categories and adjustments that we can use. There's aperture, there's shutter speed, and there's ISO. Now, those things exist on most all cameras that have a manual mode. And just a really quick rundown, I'm actually going to do a full video on these three settings coming up very soon as part of my coverage on the new Panasonic GH5. But for today's sake, let me just explain really quick. The shutter speed is how fast the shutter on the camera is moving, so how quickly it moves or how slowly it moves. It's all about regulating the light that's coming into the sensor. The aperture is how wide that the shutter is actually opening, so how wide the aperture is, basically meaning how much light is coming in each time the shutter opens and closes. And the ISO is actually an artificial way of adding light into your footage. And so there is some disadvantages and benefits of each one. As you go through them, the ISO, the higher the ISO number you get, the more light that comes into your footage, but it's all in an artificial way. So if you're filming at nighttime and you have to bump the ISO up really high, your footage is actually going to get kind of grainy. So that's the artifact that comes along with that. But there is a certain number that you can get to and it still look really good. But just as a rule of thumb, the lower the ISO, the better the video looks. Then there is shutter speed, and shutter speed controls how much motion blur that we see. So if we're shooting at a really high shutter speed, then the footage looks really kind of choppy, looks really kind of actiony. If you think about an action movie or something, they're usually shot with really high shutter speeds. The slower the shutter speed, the more natural motion blur is happening. So like, for example, this right now is being shot at 24 frames per second, and then the shutter speed's at 1/50th. So we kind of, as I move, you kind of get that natural looking blur that's happening with the motion effects. And then lastly, there's aperture, and basically the benefit of this is the wider the aperture, the better depth of field that we get, so the more blurry your background is. And that's not something that you need to worry about with a Mavic, and in this case Mavic doesn't even have the option to adjust aperture on their sensor. So there's only two settings that we're left with in the camera settings of the Mavic. We have the shutter speed and the ISO. So with the shutter speed, there is a rule that we need to be following in videography, and it's called the 180 rule. And basically it means whatever frames per second that you're shooting at, your shutter speed needs to be double that in order for the frames to line up and to not get choppy images, and just to make sure everything flows and looks the best. So for example, if you're shooting at 1080p, that's just your resolution, that doesn't matter. But if you're shooting, for example, at 1080p and you're shooting at 60 frames per second, now that's all in the camera settings menu, so 60 frames per second, then ideally your shutter speed needs to be double that. So it's 60 doubled is 120, so you're looking at 1/120th of a second for your shutter speed. That's 1/120 for your shutter speed. Now, if you are shooting in, for example, 4K and 30 frames per second, or 4K at whatever it is, let's just say 30 frames per second, then your shutter speed needs to be 1/60th of a second. So that's doubling the 30 frames per second. That's going to allow you to have a perfect sync of your frames per second and the shutter speed doubling each frame. Kind of complicated, I know, but it's really important because it's the whole point behind using ND filters. When you're shooting outside with your Mavic, you're using, there's a lot of light outside, right? There's a ton of natural light, and that's a great thing. But in order to get the correct exposure so that your sky is not super overexposed, in order to get the landscape to look good, or vice versa, your landscape's too dark and your sky looks perfect, in order to balance those out, you need to basically put on a pair of sunglasses, right? And it kind of turns down the brightness up above, lets you see everything down below correctly. So there's two purposes for ND filters. It's able to reduce the light coming into the lens or into the camera sensors, so that way your colors look more vibrant and things are more balanced between landscape and your sky. And the second reason that most of us filmmakers use ND filters is to actually lower the shutter speed, or be able to increase the f-stop on a camera of your image. So in this sense, right, we're going outside, it's really, really bright with the Mavic footage, and you'll see when I'm about to show you in these tests, the footage, in order to get a decent exposure, it's at like 1/1000th of a second for the shutter speed. That's way too fast to match that natural motion blur that you want, especially if you're mixing it with film like what I'm recording right now at 24 frames per second. My shutter speed, the closest I can get, is 1/50th of a second. So if I'm using 1/50th of a second and my Mavic footage is at 1/1200th of a second or 1/1000th of a second, it doesn't match correctly, right? So I need to lower the shutter speed. So by adding ND filters, I can lower my shutter speed down to a more usable 1/60th of a second, 1/50th, 1/80th, that kind of thing, so that we can get the footage to match up and look really, really good. So I know that is a really long technical explanation, but if you're new to these things, it's important that you know the 180 rule and why the ND filters are so important. So with all that said, let's go outside. I've got some incredible footage that I took on a recent trip, just testing out these filters. So you got some incredible volcanoes in the background in Guatemala, but I'm gonna just go ahead and cut to that now. I go through each one of these filters and show you the differences. So let's take a look. Alright guys, so I've got the drone up in the air right now, and it doesn't have any filters on it. This is straight from the Mavic, just like normal. You'll see that my ISO is set to 100, shutter at 1000, EV at 0, white balance is auto. So you'll notice right here, this is a beautiful shot of the volcano. You'll notice that the sky, it actually looks pretty decent, but it's kind of washed out a little bit. The blues are not really popping, especially over to the right. You'll notice that it's sort of washed out a little bit, and then the darker areas of the ground, the greens and stuff, they're not really popping, but again, it's a decent image, but I think it could be a lot better, especially as you go over to more of the dead areas, and this where the grass is not so green, doesn't look as good, right? So I've got that right there. Let's go ahead and switch the camera modes real quick. I'm gonna click right here and go to the actual camera and not the video mode. Frame this shot up right here, and I'm going to go to the manual settings. So we're not on auto anymore. We've switched the camera to manual, and you notice that the ISO is at 100. Now what ISO basically does here is just brighten the image artificially. So it's not letting any more light in, it's compensating for it. And so by cranking up the ISO, you'll see that the image is super washed out, right? So that's not good. The lowest you can get it is an ISO 100. Now the shutter speed is controlling like how fast the shutter is moving. So this is where you can get some frame rate issues as well if you're producing a video in 30 frames per second and you're shooting at, even lower than that, or if you're producing at 60 frames a second and so forth. We'll talk about that in another video, but right now you'll notice that I actually have to get up to about 1000 on the shutter in order for it to look pretty evenly exposed. So just right now, let's take note, we're at 1000 shutter speed, our ISO is 100, and the EV is at 00, and I'm going to go ahead and capture this image right here so you can see it on the screen. Now I'm going to bring the Mavic back, put on one of our first filters, and you'll see the difference. I've got the drone back up. I've got the Indy 4 filter on right now, and so I'm going to go ahead and capture this picture. So I've got the ISO at 100, the shutter speed at 1000. You'll notice the EV is now at -2. That's because the image is so much darker. So I'm going to capture that photo. You'll see that the image is super dark now. And I'm going to go ahead and switch to video mode so you can see how this works as I change the settings. So this is actually at ISO 1000. Now if I go into the camera settings here and change the shutter speed to try to get EV back to 0, now I've got a similar exposure as I had before without the filter, except my shutter speed is now at 200. So that is going to create a little bit better motion blur. Now, ideally, I shoot in 24 frames per second whenever I'm shooting on my DSLRs and the Lumix cameras, and so I want to get closer to that in order to get a more natural motion blur. So we're still not quite there, but I just want you to take a look at the image right now as I pan around. You'll notice the blue skies a little bit darker blue, the greens in the trees a little bit more vibrant, and those dead areas that we talked about before, the grass, they're warmer. They're a little bit warmer, okay? So you can start to see a little bit more further in the distance as well. You'll notice another volcano right there, and the clouds are starting to get exposed way out there into the left. So let's go ahead and bring it back. Let's put on the Indy 8 and see what that does. Now for me, this is where things really start to get good. So we've got the Indy 8 filter on now. I'm back into the camera mode, and let's go into our settings. You'll notice that now we're at 1.3 EV, but our shutter speed is at 200. And so in order to get EV at 0, we're going to be able to back down all the way to 80 frames per second, which is really good. We're getting closer to matching our frames per second with what we shoot on with our camera. So this is the filter that really lives on my Mavic all the time. You'll notice we can even darken this just a hair, you know, put the shutter speed at 100. I feel like that's kind of the sweet spot right there. You'll notice the blues in the sky are really nice. I'll go ahead and take that photo. The greens really pop. Let's just switch over to video real quick. And you'll see as I pan, things just look warmer, right? Things look a lot warmer. And let's look off into the distance. We're starting to see more details in those clouds now. If I roll down just a little bit more, we can get just a little better exposure to that second volcano over there. But just bringing it back to shutter speed of 100 or 80, 120. It depends on, you know, as you're moving around, how much exposure you want, what you're looking for, right? Do you want the landscape exposed really nice? Do you want the sky? But I think there's a good compromise here with the Indy 8. It's personally my favorite, and it does a really good job. Now, if you've got a super bright scene, such as today, it's midday right now, so this is considered, you know, really bright time of the day. The Indy 8, what I've got on here, works great after about, for me, after about 3 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon is when this filter really starts to shine. And early morning, I think this is a fantastic filter, but right now it's in the middle of the day, and so it's really extra bright. Let's bring it back down. I'll put the Indy 16 on, and you can see the incredible difference we get there. So really quick, to install these, all you need to do is hold on to the camera. The drone is, the Mavic Pro is off right now, just so that the gimbal motors aren't fighting it. You just hold on to the camera, you take the filter, and you just snap it on, just like that. That's all there is to it. And it's perfectly safe to have these on when your camera actually starts up and does its calibration. So I'm just going to go ahead and power on the Mavic right now. My controller's already on. You'll notice it goes through its calibration, no problem at all, and it's ready to roll. So that's a huge benefit to the Cine series from Polar Pro. You can leave them on all the time, and you don't have to worry about it messing with your camera calibration. Alright, so we have the Indy 16 filter on now, and we're going to go back into the camera settings here, go back to manual mode, and you'll notice we're at -1.7. and we're at 120 on the shutter speed. So let's go ahead and roll this down to 0. And now we're at 40. So if I'm shooting in 24 frames per second on my camera, you need to double that for your shutter speed. So that's going to be 50 frames per second. So if I want my frames per second of my Mavic videos to match what I'm doing on my Panasonic camera, I need to be shooting at this. And so I'm just going to go ahead and capture this image so you can see it. I'm going to switch back over to video mode and hit record so that you can see. And just to notice back again, from the very beginning, you'll notice that up there on the right, the blues are more consistent all the way across the sky. There's not as much blowout. The greens, very dark, very rich. The deads are warm. The dead areas are warm. And look back there. You can really see that volcano now, even more so, just because of how the neutral density filter is working. So we could even dial this down, change it a little bit more, make it a little darker, and you could get a really, really rich colors out of it. Almost too much though, because we've got some black there in the video from the lava beds. That's actually from when Pacaya, the volcano here, erupted. All of that black is lava. And so, but let's look over here. You'll notice we kind of get an orange tint to everything when we go too dark, and that's just because the neutral density filter is doing that. And so if we bring it up just a hair, we get rid of that orange, and resting right there at shutter speed 50, ISO 100. The EV is -0.3, which is just right below perfect exposure. For me, I think this is really the sweet spot for this time of day. You know, we're going to need to go to the 16 filter, the ND 16 filter, in order to get that 50, in order to get that shutter speed of 50 to match what I'm shooting here on my camera. So yeah, that's basically it. And so obviously if you're going to be shooting in really, really bright conditions, like snowy conditions and stuff, you're going to even want a darker one, maybe a 32. That's what the Cine Series 6 pack is going to give you. But for me, for the majority of what I'm shooting, it's landscapes like this. And so let's just go ahead and take a little flight around, see some of the beautiful area, and I'll leave you with some of this video. So there's a look at the Polar Pro filters for the Mavic Pro. I do highly recommend them. Make sure you pick up the Cine series. That's really, really important because they're the ones that can actually stay on the Mavic during the initial camera calibration and all that. So literally you can just stick these on there like I do. I've got the ND8 on there all the time, even though I pack it up, put it away. The gimbal cover, all that stuff goes on and stays on just fine with these installed. So definitely pick up the Cine series. I'm going to leave links in the description below. You can get this 3-pack set. It's the Vivid Collection by Polar Pro. You can pick them up for $79.99 from Amazon.com. I've got links in the description below, so be sure and click there for the best pricing that you can get. I definitely recommend that you pick these up, guys. It's a worthwhile investment, not only to protect your camera lens, but in all kinds of situations, you're going to be able to get the most out of your footage. It's going to look incredibly good, and it's just going to up your footage. It's going to change the way things look, and it's going to set you apart from others that are using drones. So that's going to do it for today's video, guys. I hope that it's been helpful. I know it's been a little bit of a longer video, but I wanted to show you everything I possibly could about these incredible filters and how I think they really, really up your footage and make things look excellent. So thanks for watching. As always, guys, I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next video.